Welcome. My name's John Bagnulo, and I'm really excited to be with you today and to be joined by Laura Doherty, who's an expert on the ketogenic diet and its therapeutic potential and effects for patients. It's a topic that I know Laura and I hear significant amounts of interest in from clinicians, about learning more about a ketogenic diet, kind of the nuances of that. And so what we hope to do today is to give you an overview first on the science behind a ketogenic diet, looking at the influences it has on our physiology, but in particular on the brain. Laura and I will both focus on how a ketogenic diet and the ketones that are formed during nutritional ketosis, how those can help offset some of the more, for lack of a better description, normal pathological changes that we see with an aging brain. So with that being said, we'll get started. Both Laura and I are employed by Nutritional Medicinals. Laura's the national clinical manager for Nutritional Medicinals, and I serve as the director of nutrition and research and development. Laura and I have these four learning objectives for you today. First, be able to describe those changes that take place with aging that really compromise brain function. Those are endocrine, circulatory, and some molecular changes that we would describe as being pathology related aging. List those dietary factors that contribute to brain inflammation. You'll learn that inflammation is a big part of this pathology that we see with an aging brain. It's going to be important that you can identify the specific processes that ketones play in the brain and how that molecule in particular can really mitigate some of this aging process, and then be able to list brain boosting foods and find ways to incorporate those into a daily diet or selection of foods. So with that being said, let's dive in. And I think one of the first things that we should establish is in identifying a ketogenic diet. Let me just give you this illustration to try to convey some of that. So here are some common ketogenic diet clinical ratios, and you can see that what we're looking at here when we describe a ratio, basically we're looking at the grams of fat in comparison to the aggregate of grams of carbohydrate and grams of protein. So a 4-to-1 clinical ratio is, an example of that would be if you had 200 grams of fat and you had 50 grams of carbohydrate and protein, together. And that's, again, when we talk about carbohydrate, we're talking about net carbohydrates. So we subtract the fiber from that. And then that ratio continues to drop, as you can see here on this chart, until you get down to something that's, less than 1-to-1. We start to get into, it's not a ketogenic diet. It's more of a Atkins type, modified Atkins diet. And then there are these MCT or medium chain triglyceride diets that may in fact promote an increase in ketones in circulation, but certainly shouldn't be defined as a ketogenic diet because they do miss some of the important principles of that. So there's and Laura's going to get into this in much greater detail and really speak from her vast experience in terms of working with different patients that have different metabolic requirements and sensitivities to ketosis. And so it's not necessarily one size fits all, but this is just, trying to give us a picture here of what a ketogenic diet could look like. And I would consider the top two, a 4-to-1, a 3-to-1, as the ones that would typically work for more people than not. When you get down to a 2-to-1 ketogenic diet, there might be children where, where this works to promote ketone production, and we could still have somewhat of a state of nutritional ketosis. But it's really those top two, 4-to-1, 3-to-1 clinical ratio that tends to work for most adults. And that's, what I often look for when I Um, when I assess the results of a study that's published, I always want to say, well, hey, what was this population actually on a ketogenic diet? And what's interesting is that there's so much research out there that isn't really including a true ketogenic diet, and that washes out some of the effects that we would expect to see. There's a large number of studies, published, peer-reviewed papers that show less than statistically significant differences between quote unquote ketogenic diets and a more standardized or controlled diet. And when you really dive into the details of the study and the study design, and you look at the clinical ratios, in many cases they're absent, and um, they're certainly not definitive of a ketogenic diet. So I really want everyone to understand that this is an important part. I'd call this the elephant in the room, honestly. And we're talking about the aging brain today and how a ketogenic diet can be therapeutic to an aging brain and really help offset some of those changes that we want to prevent. And I would say the same is true with this as it is with the potential for a ketogenic diet to help a cancer patient, to help maybe their more conventional chemotherapy, radiation therapy be more effective. I think there's some really, really compelling arguments that would be made when you pull apart and you conduct a meta-analysis and you look at different conditions and the role that a ketogenic diet can play in helping patients with those conditions. If you conduct a meta-analysis and you pull apart the details and you eliminate all of the studies that actually don't use a ketogenic diet, but use something that's, halfway between that and a more normal controlled type diet, that's when you really start to see a sharp contrast and much, much more statistical significance. So that's why I'm really sharing this with you, is that there are a lot of different approaches out there, and many fall short of being a true ketogenic diet. And we have to be careful that we don't lump all of them together and say, well, there's some clinical evidence. I think that there's strong clinical evidence with respect to a ketogenic diet and brain health and helping a brain be more insulin sensitive, et cetera, which we're going to get into now. So what are the basic if I were to give you this most simple reasons as to why a ketogenic diet can offset some of the normal aging related processes in the brain, the number one reason is that a ketogenic diet, in essence, mimics a fasting state. And people are really surprised to hear this. I mean, again, there are a lot of reasons. We're going to get to those. But the number one reason is that human metabolism doesn't recognize, when I say metabolism, I'm not just talking about the digestion of and the liver. I'm talking about cellular metabolism. Human metabolism, and this is true for most mammals, those cells do not recognize the entry of fatty acids into the cell, and the use of fat alone to generate ATP, that is not recognized as a more classic postprandial, the organism has just eaten type of state, meaning that protein and carbohydrates both are associated and drive changes cellularly that are postprandial in nature. But fat alone, or a diet that's for the most part largely comprised of fatty acids, does not break that fasting type of state. And so insulin is at the core for a lot of this. And when you have a fasting state and insulin is as low as it can be physiologically, well, that results in the increased secretion of glucagon, an increase in epinephrine, but importantly, an increase in this activated protein kinase, or AMPK, as you see on this slide. And activated protein kinase is a huge win for the brain. It has so many beneficial effects. And this is why fasting, whether it's a long, 24-hour fast or it's intermittent fasting, that's why that has also received so much attention and so much, of our resources devoted to the research on intermittent fasting and its ability to help certain conditions, the role that it plays in genetic expression. But a lot of it has to do with this molecule, this incredible molecule, activated protein kinase. And that really starts to drive upwards at much, much higher levels when we're in a fasting state and when we're in a state of nutritional ketosis. So again, ketogenesis, or the production of ketones, in this case, beta hydroxybutyrate, that's going to take place when we have lipolysis taking place, fatty acids entering the mitochondria. The mitochondria is central to this conversation today. The mitochondria is where acetyl-CoA, from being broken down from fatty acids, it's run through that Krebs cycle, and we will take acetyl-CoA and as a byproduct that we're going to produce this beta hydroxybutyrate, a ketone, and that ketone can then be used by neurons and can be used by our physiology in sometimes a much, much more effective manner than if we were trying to rely on carbohydrate metabolism. And so understanding that there's a large number of people, typically older people, whether we want to say over the age of 60 or over the age of 70, that would be more of a gray area. That'd be up for debate. But we know that in older adults, there is a significant percentage of American adults that have a level of insulin resistance with respect to the brain and neurological function. And, we want to maintain a level of metabolic flexibility. We want to be able to use fatty acids, ketones, and glucose to meet our metabolic requirements on that cellular level, especially when it comes to neurons. And for many individuals, it's not until they get in a state of nutritional ketosis that they have any metabolic flexibility. And that's really what, again, that's at the core of how a ketogenic diet, in the presence of these ketones at higher than normal levels in the morning when we first wake up, but with more significant time in a state of nutritional ketosis, these ketone levels rise to the point where they provide energy to neurons that really hasn't been there and has led to a state of energy crisis. So, but again, the ketogenic diet, I don't want to make this overly simplified. And I want everybody to understand that there are a number of really profound processes that are at work and that are synergistic. I mean, number one, a ketogenic diet, which is for the most part eliminated, carbohydrates down to where they only provide somewhere around 5 to, let's say 5 to 8% of calories, that is going to have a huge influence on the microbiome. And we'll look at that a little later on here. Higher levels of autophagy, which is where the cell, every cell in the body, when it detects there's some sort of energy shortage, which again, that the ketogenic diet, it's looked at more as a fasting state than it is a fed state. And so our cells interpret it as an energy shortage or the one that's on the way. And then the cells all start to recycle damaged organelles and components of the cell that no longer serve that cell's function. That's a really beneficial phase to go through on a regular basis. Increased NAD levels, mTOR inhibition, which is really important, especially we get into certain conditions, certain types of cancer. cancers, I should say, increased activated protein kinase as well as sirtuins, and then increased apoptosis, which is, we really want our senescent cells that are no longer functional. We want those to be cleared from our cell pool, and a ketogenic diet really helps with that. So these are a few of those processes going on. And as I mentioned earlier, the mitochondria, that little organelle that we all learn about, probably for the first time in our high school biology course, that little organelle, which converts all of our carbohydrates, our amino acids, and our fatty acids to ATP, as well as lactic acid, of course, all of those substrates are converted to ATP in the mitochondria. So when our mitochondria become leaky, when they have damaged components, that's when we see an enormous increased risk for one of many neurodegenerative diseases, neurological conditions, and certainly in all of this, some of these being much more extreme in terms of how they affect an individual, but cognitive decline is tied into this. It's just at a different end of the spectrum. And so keeping our mitochondrial population as healthy as possible and stimulating biogenesis whenever we can through a ketogenic diet, actually creating some new functional mitochondria, as well as trying to clear the dysfunctional mitochondria from a cell through the autophagy that was mentioned in the previous slide. That's why really resuscitating mitochondria is one of the greatest attributes of a ketogenic diet. And we know now that there are really good clinical papers demonstrating, studies I should say, and research that demonstrates how a ketogenic diet can help support patients, improve quality of life, help that patient get to a much better place overall with ALS, Parkinson's, as well as Rett syndrome, epilepsy. It's very well documented. But again, Laura and I are both really focusing on cognitive impairment, dementia, and trying to prevent that type of aging pathological change in the brain. So we know that there are a variety of reasons why the modern human's mitochondria are damaged. Inflammation is a core component. We know that with all chronic disease. Mitochondria are very sensitive to inflammation because with inflammation, there's high levels of oxidative stress, and the free radicals and all of the peroxides that are generated when that mitochondrial membrane starts to be flooded with reactive oxygen species and all of this oxidative stress, it's very damaging. And that causes that leakiness, those perforations in the mitochondrial membrane that are really responsible for not just aging of the brain, but aging, period. And so, more so than the glutamic acid that might be an issue with someone that has Rett syndrome. But, again, higher levels of glutamic acid are not good for anybody's mitochondria. But inflammation and oxidative stress are the two big ones that we're going to really look at as to, how we can offset some of that. But there are some other mechanisms that cause mitochondrial loss and mitochondrial damage. The toxins that come from our gut, from the microbiome, are front and center. We know that there are so many endotoxins released into circulation across that gut barrier from pathogenic species of bacteria, some of which we might pick up from our environment. Certain species of blue-green algae, for instance, are clearly associated with Parkinson's and ALS. And for people that have that type of blue-green algae in their immediate environment, or they spend a lot of time on the water, breathing the sprays of that water, eating fish that are caught in those waters, we know that there's a strong relationship there to developing ALS and Parkinson's because of the way these toxins affect neurons in the brain over time. I've already talked about a loss of metabolic flexibility with so many older adults being entirely dependent on carbohydrate metabolism. And once you start to develop insulin resistance of the brain, then that's when you're going to see the kind of energy crisis that causes dementia. A variety of other environmental toxins, lead and other heavy metals. And I've mentioned briefly the sensitivity to things such as glutamic acid. So there's really a long list of how and why mitochondria become damaged and why there's inflammation of the brain in general. But let's get to the ketogenic diet, which is, as I mentioned, one that's around 85% of calories coming from fat, roughly 10%. This would be for an adult that maybe has some insulin resistance and it has to be much more stringent. So again, Laura's going to get into this here in just a few minutes. But when you have that, roughly 85% of calories coming from fat and 5% or so from carbohydrates, insulin levels are going to be really, really low. And that's going to improve circulation. And again, when we talk about, because this is one of my learning objectives for you today, when we talk about the changes that take place with aging that compromise brain function, again, we have endocrine changes, right? Which would be insulin resistance. That really affects brain health. Then we have circulatory changes that take place when we age. People have a much, much harder time delivering adequate blood flow to distal areas of the brain through these tiny capillaries once we start to have circulatory changes that compromise that. Excessive vasoconstriction being an example of that. Tiny microvessel clots that occur and eventually cause things like TIAs. But before that, you just have compromised blood flow to the brain. And then a decrease or an overall reduction in some of those really important therapeutic molecules, such as activated protein kinase. Again, there's just a long list of changes that take place from the molecular to the more organ system type changes. And here you see, how that ketogenic diet delivers the beta hydroxybutyrate because of the way the medium chain triglycerides, and again, medium chain triglycerides, Laura is going to spend more time as an expert in that particular molecule and how they can really help someone on a ketogenic diet. Those medium chain triglycerides, however, bypass normal fat metabolism and they go directly to the liver where they can be used to really generate large amounts of ketones. Again, ketones can be produced endogenously, and they can also be kind of added to the menu, so to speak, when they're taken as MCTs on top of a diet. But once those ketones get into circulation, they reach the brain, and it's the central nervous system, kind of more in general, receive those, both the MCTs as well as the beta hydroxybutyrate, the ketone body. And that's where you see here, mitochondria are getting an energy source that they may not have had for a very long time because of the overall dietary pattern by the individual, which is, again, for most people, it's very carbohydrate based. So in those ketones on that molecular level, as you can see here, there's a lot going on in this slide, but you can see an increased level of NAD, which I spoke to in a moment. You can see that, again, insulin production is blocked. Certain catecholamines, however, are upregulated, and those catecholamines, such as epinephrine and norepinephrine, which often, at moderate levels in a state of nutritional ketosis, really stimulate very favorable changes. And in conjunction with ketone bodies, that's where you're going to get this mitochondrial biogenesis, which can, again, increase the viable population of mitochondria. And all of this, you can see, sirtuin-1 levels. Everything is very sensitive here to the increased level of ketones, the lower level of insulin, and ultimately it affects gene transcription. So there's an incredible amount of downstream influence from a rise in ketone bodies in conjunction with blocking insulin production. That's what this slide really attempts to illustrate. So those sirtuins are often referred to as a fountain of youth, so to speak, on a molecular level. So is the activated protein kinase. I talked a little bit about apoptosis, and that is primarily governed through that P53 gene. And that P53 gene, again, when conditions are right and the binding site is occupied properly, that P53 gene expression will eliminate cells that may be virally or have cancer components and mutated genetic material. But those virally infected cells, those cancerous cells, can be cleaned out through a lysolysis type of self-destruction with that P53 gene expression. And again, all of this is being achieved without an energy deficit, because the ketogenic diet is providing all of the energy necessary, and without any type of nutrient deficiency, because a ketogenic diet can be very nutrient dense and can provide everything that an individual or a patient needs. So, but let me go to the microbiome here, because I don't want to take up too much more time. I really want to give Laura a chance to dive into the qualitative aspects of this. The microbiome is clearly influenced by a ketogenic diet, primarily because of the absence of certain types or families of carbohydrates, which favor the growth, sometimes the overgrowth of species of bacteria that really aren't conducive to optimal health. And because of microbiome, a ketogenic diet also favors in the microbiome families of bacteria that do better with a fasting type state. An example of that would be Akkermansia, which is a really important family of bacteria for us to be the most insulin sensitive, for us to have the greatest resiliency and resistance to certain types of chronic diseases. Akkermansia has been really well studied, and we know that ketogenic diets are one of the most effective ways to build Akkermansia in the gut. But again, the microbiome changes, and then that changes epigenetic effects, because the microbiome has so much influence on epigenetics and gene expression. So that's where the ketogenic diet is really far reaching, much more so than just limiting carbohydrate intake, keeping blood sugar levels low, and getting these ketones that could be used to maybe stimulate one aspect of our health or not. It's really a comprehensive, very favorable influence on human health. And this really shows how you get those changes. And you can see here towards the very bottom of this slide, you can see the changes in certain families of bacteria that occur. And there's Akkermansia, which definitely increases on that ketogenic diet, as well as higher levels of, this is on the left-hand side here, you can see higher levels of SCFAs, that's short-chain fatty acids, and that really improves the blood-brain barrier and the integrity of that. So there in itself, there are two really important and very favorable changes that take place when the microbiome or the gut is essentially rebuilt when a person's on a ketogenic diet for a while. But quality is important. Again, I've talked about 85% of calories from fat, and that those should predominantly be from monounsaturated fats. It's also important to keep tight regulation on the amount of polyunsaturated fat, and you want to have small amounts of omega-6s and small amounts of omega-3s. Protein can be higher than 10%, but this is just a kind of an attempt to give you a quick picture here, and Laura's going to get into this in greater detail here now. And then there's some other things. I think that branched chain amino acids are really beneficial to a ketogenic diet, or a patient on a ketogenic diet, as well as using creatine and having high levels of choline through eating things like egg yolks. So, again, there's a lot of different ways to adopt a ketogenic diet. I'm always in favor of a ketogenic diet that's rich in whole foods, and in particular, very rich in vegetables, the non-starchy vegetables that contain polyphenols and antioxidants, so that it's a very complex, multifactorial intervention. And I like the ketogenic Mediterranean diet. I like the ketogenic Japanese diet, an Asian diet. There's so many different versions of a ketogenic diet, but the important thing is that quality is paid attention to. And when that's the case, when we look at the effects of, in this case, a Mediterranean ketogenic diet, where quality mattered, and olive oil was being used as opposed to industrial seed oils like, corn oil, sunflower oil that are high in omega-6s, you can see here that N-butyrate, that's on the far right-hand side of this slide, the N-butyrate levels were much higher in that Mediterranean ketogenic diet than they were in the American Heart Association diet. And that N-butyrate, that is a big part of the story as well, because it is a preferred fuel source for so much of our physiology. And that's going to be a function of really what the microbiome looks like. And again, you can look at this in a lot of different ways, but here, when you look at Alzheimer's disease, you can see that the modified Mediterranean ketogenic diet had markedly lower levels of bacterial toxins, and everything was really much more favorable in terms of the changes that were gut derived or microbiome derived in comparison to the control diet. So, coconut oil is 67 to 70%. 2/3 or more of the fat in coconut oil is made up of medium chain triglycerides, which is phenomenal. And then you can get even higher levels of medium chain triglycerides when you start using MCT oil or refined coconut oils. And so I think it's a great fat to use because it's also, of course, very low in polyunsaturated fat, and it's great for lipid membrane stability. So with that, I'm excited to turn it over to you, Laura. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Bagnulo. I'm going to go ahead and get the baton over to me. Okay. So Dr. Bagnulo talked about ketogenic diets in terms of macronutrient percent at the beginning of today's session. But I wanted to briefly speak on what a ketogenic diet means in terms of grams of carbohydrates daily. How does that truly break down to what patients are tracking and what that looks like from a food serving and standpoint. But I think it's important to keep in mind, and Dr. Bagnulo alluded to this, that ketogenic diets can go by multiple different names. Some of the more common ones used in clinical practice are going to be your classic ketogenic diet, which is probably most familiar in the epilepsy population, but then there's that modified Atkins diet, just a generic low carb, high fat diet, low glycemic index treatments, and modified ketogenic diets. And honestly, the list of names for ketogenic diets could go on and on and on. And these various names do make it difficult to comparatively evaluate research studies because the ketogenic diet can truly mean so many things, and there really isn't a standard definition at this time. So for example, a classic ketogenic diet is likely the most restrictive form of keto therapy, where the amount of carbs may be limited to 2 grams daily. And I know that seems extreme, and that is really, from a clinical standpoint, the only time I've ever seen that level of ketogenic diet used would be pediatric epilepsy. But then upwards of some of the other types of ketogenic diets, the least restrictive forms is going around 60 grams of carbohydrates a day. And I think it's important to realize, and like Dr. Bagnulo said, this is, for most of these types of ketogenic diets, it is net carbs. So total carbohydrates minus the fiber component. When Dr. Bagnulo was talking, I noticed a question came in, which is, this is a really good question, is, why do we subtract all of the fiber to get these net carbs? Where did that come from? Because for individuals with diabetes, one of the recommendations is if it's above 5 grams of fiber, you only subtract half of it. It's great. It's a great question. I don't have the perfect answer other than subtracting all of the fiber is just kind of what we've done in the ketogenic community for a long time, and it's worked, right? The goal is producing ketone bodies, and so by subtracting all the fiber, we still have been able to do that for most patients. Now, that's not to say that's every patient, but it's also not to say that I certainly had patients that were eating a ton of fiber, like upwards of 30 to 40 grams a day, and I did have to not subtract all of it. So it's a very individualized approach. But ultimately, by definition, a ketogenic diet is any diet that includes a metabolic shift from mixed glucose to primarily fat ketone utilization. So Where that level is, whether it's 2 grams or 60 grams, is really individualized. It's based off of gender, age, caloric needs, exercise, just to name a few. And so, but I would say if we're talking general levels, most adults, if you're getting in that 50, 60 grams of net carbs a day, most healthy adults at least can produce ketones at that level. But again, that's a very general statement and may not apply to everyone. So let's look at the reality. Let me see, did my slide advance, Dr. Bagnulo? Okay, there it goes. I think it's a little delayed, so I apologize. So let's look at the reality of how do we truly achieve the American Heart Association recommendation for total dietary fiber intake of 25 to 30 grams a day. Because I think the first thing, I think when dietitians, especially when I first started getting into keto therapy, I started thinking like, oh, we're restricting fruits and vegetables, and what about fiber, and what about this? And I think that's easy to do. But the reality is fiber is encouraged, and fruits and vegetables are encouraged because you only get 40 grams of carbs a day. And so you want to spend those carbohydrates wisely on fruits and vegetables. So I want to talk a little bit about how do you achieve fiber recommendations, and how do you achieve servings of fruits and vegetable recommendations on a ketogenic diet? So the key here is, again, we're subtracting the fiber. So if I'm prescribing somebody 50 grams of net carbs a day, but their fiber goal is 25, they're really getting total carbs around 75 grams a day. And what gives you the best quality carbs in our diet today other than fruits and vegetables? So this chart that's coming up next is kind of a list of my favorite keto-friendly veggies to work into a ketogenic diet. And this is not an exhausted list. These are kind of my 6 top go-tos. And it's not to say that all 6 of these have to be in a diet. I have a very much a mentality of, if you don't like a food, I'm never going to encourage somebody to eat it. So just choosing 2 or 3 of these can make a big, big difference. So asparagus, and these are not in any specific order, but asparagus, love that for the anti-inflammatory and antioxidant components. Arugula is a great detoxifying agent and anti-inflammatory qualities as well. Avocado, yes, I realize it's a fruit, but I have found over the years most patients and most people refer to this as a vegetable. So I'm just including it here, not to split hairs, but I love avocados, and I'm going to talk about them in great detail in a few more slides. But avocados are great. They're great for so many reasons. They are high in monounsaturated fats. They are high in magnesium, fiber, and potassium. And those are 3 things that can be difficult to get on a ketogenic diet. But also on this list is the brassica vegetable, so your broccoli, your Brussels sprouts, cabbage. And those uniquely contain something called glucosinolates, which can really help fight against several chronic diseases. And then also celery, spinach, I don't want to ignore these, but they're on the list and they're great sources. Now, one of the things that you may notice about this list is all these are green. It's not to say that you can't work in other colored vegetables, because you definitely can. Eggplant comes to mind, tomatoes come to mind, and even carrots, which are sometimes considered sweet or higher in carbohydrates. In a well-planned, well-thought-out keto diet, carrots can even have a role. Switching gears, we're going to come back to vegetables in a second, but switching gears here just slightly, I want to talk about fructose for a few minutes, because I think in general, when we're thinking ketogenic diets, just by definition, they're going to be lower in fruit and therefore fructose than most diets, especially your standard American diet. But I want to talk about what fructose means not only for a ketogenic diet, but also in general, because I think it's an area where there's a lot of confusion. So general research suggests that most adults should limit their fructose to no more than 10 grams per meal and 25 to 40 grams per day. But at the same time, the 2020-2025 dietary guidelines for Americans recommend 1.5 to 2 cups of fruits for women and 2 to 2.5 cups of fruits for men. So how do we meet our daily fruit goal but not exceed the fructose goal? And further, how do we do this on a ketogenic diet? And these are great questions that I think a lot of people have concerns about. And again, it goes back to choosing your fruits and choosing your vegetables and ultimately choosing fats wisely. So the chart at the top is an example of achieving fruit servings and minimizing fructose for someone who is on a ketogenic diet. And therefore, they're restricting overall net carb content. So by choosing low fructose, high fiber options, so in this particular example, a half a cup of strawberries is going to be 2 grams of fructose and 4.5 grams of net carbs. Maybe you have those strawberries on a salad with eggs and chicken, some leafy greens, olive oil, and avocado. And then for snack throughout the day, you have 1 cup of blueberries, which has 7 grams of fructose and 9 grams of net carbs. So that really brings you to 2.5 servings of fruit based on a half a cup of berries being a fruit serving, 9 grams of fructose, well below that 25 to 40 gram limit, and net carbs at 13.5. So let's say your ketogenic diet is 30 grams of net carbs. You still have 16.5 grams to spend on veggies or other options. The one I want to mention here is I didn't even include avocado in this chart, which is, again, technically a fruit and only has 0.175 grams of fructose in 1 cup of sliced. That 1 cup of sliced avocado also provides 12.6 grams of total carbs, 10 grams of fiber, so only 2.5 grams of net carbs. I didn't include it in the chart because I felt like that was kind of cheating and a really easy way to prove this point, but I do want to emphasize that the avocado really is the keto power food. Now, if we look at this from a broader perspective and not considering a ketogenic diet here for just real quick, you really can get a lot of fruit servings in a day and still stay under the 25 to 40 grams of total fructose. So looking at the second table, this is, and I'm not saying you need to eat 4 servings of fruit. This is an example to show you that it can be done. In 4 servings of fruit, you can get 25 grams of fructose by combining, again, all whole fruits here and combining them with maybe what we would consider a high fructose fruit like mango or apples to a low fructose fruit like citrus and berries. So ultimately, when I start thinking about limiting fructose, I think the easiest and the most obvious way is to avoid the use of sweeteners. Those are absolutely a no in the ketogenic diet, but this also includes sweeteners that we may think of as more natural sweeteners, such as honey and agave syrup. But making sure you're choosing whole, lower fructose containing fruits, such as berries and citrus fruits, and limiting or balancing out the high fructose containing fruits. Now, the whole foods of that would be like your mangoes and your apples and your bananas, but definitely avoiding the fruit juice and dried fruit options. So this next chart, I'm kind of bringing the whole vegetable and fruit concept together here. And by looking at a full day's worth of vegetable and fruit consumption on a ketogenic diet. It's possible to achieve 100% of your recommended fiber, 100% of your fruit servings, and 100% of your vegetable servings if you choose wisely. This chart demonstrates, and of course, this chart doesn't have the fat or the protein or anything added. I'm just focusing on the carbohydrates and the fiber here. But if we start at breakfast, having maybe some scrambled eggs with green peppers and kale worked in, and I only spent 2 grams of net carbs. Then at lunch, having a big, huge leafy spinach salad with chopped carrots and broccoli and some strawberries. Snacks, focusing on, again, the love of avocado, but also berries and celery stalks that you could pair with maybe a high-fat dip. And then rounding out the day with asparagus at dinner. And in total, this is bringing in 26.5 grams of carbs and 33.5 grams of fiber. So really focusing on meeting all of those goals. And this is where dietitians are so integral to a ketogenic diet because most patients can't put something like this together themselves. They need guidance on how to get enough fruits and vegetables on a keto plan. And this is where the dietitian can really guide and make sure we're not doing a bacon, butter, steak ketogenic diet, and we're really focusing on healthy options. Something else I want to point out about this particular chart is I didn't include any nuts or seeds, which are certainly good choices for a ketogenic diet. Adding some nuts and seeds throughout this chart would continue to boost fiber, also healthy fats without breaking the net carb bank per se. For example, one of my favorite fats to add to ketogenic diet plans is going to be macadamia nuts. So 2 ounces of macadamia nuts are 5 grams of fiber, 3 grams net carbs, and 22 grams of fat, which of that 22 grams, about 17 is going to be monounsaturated. And that kind of leads me into the next topic I want to talk about, which is going to be your fat sources. This is one of my favorite graphics, and this is from the Canadian Nutrient File and USDA National Nutrient Database. I love this because it represents very clearly that fat sources, olive oil, canola oil, whatever, are not just one type of fat. You know, we think of olive oil as a monounsaturated fat, but it also does have polyunsaturated fats in it. So it's easy to classify fats based off the majority of what's in them, but fat sources are a variety of fat options. I think that's important to remember when we're talking about balance. I also want to point out here, you know, eggs, and I'm not going to talk about eggs a ton, but eggs are not on this list. But I feel like eggs are very, very important to a ketogenic diet. But they're a blend of saturated fat, omega-3, poly, and then monounsaturated fats as well. And research has shown when we start talking about quality of the foods we eat, that free-range chickens have significantly higher amounts of omega-3 polyunsaturated fat in their eggs. So on the next few slides, what I'm going to do is I want to talk about fat sources and using fats appropriately to avoid lipid oxidation and degradation type situations. So this is a chart, and yes, I'm dividing things into types of fat, but based off of the percentage of fat in these items, let's first focus on fats that fall into the monounsaturated category, which for me clinically is probably my biggest promoter. So I recommend lots and lots of monounsaturated fats in the diet, because not only do I think they're incredibly healthy, but I think they're incredibly versatile in terms of cooking, and they really can add some palatability to a ketogenic diet. So olives, almonds, avocados, macadamia nuts, olive oil, avocado oil are all kind of my go-to fat sources in the mono category. And so I love these. And then I want to switch over to saturated fats and say, don't run away. You know, butter, ghee, coconut oil, grass-fed beef, you know, those are saturated fat options that really do can play an active and a healthy role within a ketogenic diet. Now, you may be thinking, wait, Laura, isn't saturated fat bad? And for many years, saturated fat has been vilified. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying only eat saturated fat. I'm not recommending bacon and butter and steak as a healthy overall ketogenic diet, but we do have data to support that saturated fat may not be as evil as we think. For example, the PURE study, which is a large epidemiological study that looked at the relationship between macronutrients and cardiovascular disease and enrolled over 100,000 adults, found that a high carbohydrate intake was associated with higher risk of total mortality. Both the total fat intake and type of fat, including saturated, were not associated with cardiovascular disease, myocardial infarctions, or cardiovascular disease mortality. And that reference, if you haven't read that study, will be on the reference page when we send it out with the continuing professional education certificate. Then finally, polyunsaturated fats. These are also can be healthy, and they can also be worked into a diet, but we do have to choose these wisely because these are fats that can often be degraded by oxidation and maybe be treated with some disrespect, and then they're not so healthy to our bodies. Some of my favorites from this category are going to be flax seeds, including the oil, chia seeds, and walnuts. But at the end of the day, this is about balance. It's important to eat a balance of all these types of fats, not just one over the other or labeling them good, bad, or ugly. It's about choosing quality ingredients and keeping all this into perspective. So when I talk about treating oils with respect, this essentially means making smart cooking choices. So don't disrespect your fats by using them incorrectly. You know, and this means that there are certain fats that are better than others for cooking. Monounsaturated and saturated fats tend to be less susceptible to oxidation. So they're great for high heat cooking. So that's why my big favorite is avocado oil when I'm cooking for my family. Medium or medium high heat, such as sauteing and baking, I'm choosing extra virgin olive oil, butter, or coconut oil. Coconut oil specifically adds some nice palatability and flavor to products, as well as butter. And then for cold dishes, I choose flaxseed oil. It's a great source of alpha-linolenic acid, but unfortunately, flaxseed oil has a very low smoke point of about 200, 225 degrees, so you don't want to cook with it. So again, making sure your clients, your patients know which oils are best to use for what scenario. MCTs. So I love MCTs, and I would say when I was practicing, most of my patients got to some degree of MCT. Now, whether that was from a natural source, such as coconut oil, which is 65, Dr. Bagnolo 67, as mentioned 67, around that range of 65 to 70% of coconut oil is MCT. Palm kernel oil and butter to a small amount has MCT in it as well. Or supplemental sources that are now coming in liquids, powders, pills. The one thing I will emphasize about MCT oil supplementally is please don't cook with it because it is not heat stable. But the benefits of MCTs for patients on a ketogenic diet is it can help regulate bowel movements. It provides a quick and efficient energy source in the form of ketones, and it doesn't require carnitine for digestion. And that can really play a huge role when you have somebody eating a large amount of fat and not getting enough carnitine from their diet or being made in their body. MCTs can kind of help buffer that. So what do I do with MCT? So I get this question all the time from patients. And the thing is, the opportunities are endless. I think a really easy thing to do with MCT is to add it to beverages, cold beverages, hot beverages. Coconut oil dissolved in your coffee in the morning can make a really nice palatable product. If you're doing an MCT oil supplement in a beverage that's heated, just make sure you're heating the beverage first and then adding the MCT oil. But adding it to foods such as low carb yogurt or a smoothie, drizzling it over salads, fat bomb incorporation, taking it like a shot. I have one of my favorite patients he was such a champ. He didn't like it added to anything, so he just took it like a shot. And that worked for him. He took it through a syringe, and that's what he did 3 times a day at every meal. Or mixing it into a sauce or dip is another option. Switching back to avocados, because I can't end this presentation without telling you about all my favorite things in terms of avocado, is what I love about them is they are flavorless for the most part. So I can hide them in a lot of things. I can recommend them to my patients a lot of different ways. So adding them to soups, salads, smoothies, sauces, hummus are all really great options. You can even make it more simple than that by just seasoning them with salt and pepper or adding them to scrambled eggs. If you want to get a little bit more creative, you can add them to desserts and pancake batter. There are options now on making keto-friendly pancakes with macadamia nuts and almond flour, and you just add the avocado, which can add fat, which is great, but also make a moister end result. So really, you can take this to the moon and back in terms of creativity. A few of the things that we do at my house, because I think it's important to practice what I preach, is one of my favorites is we will cut the avocado in half, remove the seed, which the kids really love digging around in the avocado to get the seeds out, the big seeds. So drizzling it with lemon juice and olive oil, and then we just place it cut side down on a grill and cook for 2 to 3 minutes and then season however we want it to. Super easy, super quick. And also a great way to get some keto involvement. And then in terms of if you're one of those people who gets so tired of avocados going to waste on your counter because they turn brown so fast, I get it. It happens to me all the time. So I really love buying the frozen avocados and just pulling out what I need because freezing really does preserve the integrity of nutrients. So that can be one way to try and eliminate the waste. And I know Dr. Bagnulo and I have covered a lot today. We're going to open it up for questions here in just a second, but I want to take a moment to summarize and pull this all together. First and foremost, choose your carbs wisely. It's a budget. You get 30 grams of net carbs a day. I wouldn't suggest squandering them on M&Ms and Oreos. If you choose wisely, you can get enough fiber, you can get enough fruit and vegetables, plus you're getting all of those phytonutrients that you aren't going to get from some other carb sources. Keep your fats in balance. Load up on mono and saturated fats. They're great to cook with. Don't be afraid of saturated fats, but no one is saying that those are the only option. They play a role. MCT sources specifically, coconut oil is a great, again, plays a major role in ketogenic diets for energy metabolism to be a quick energy source. Don't omit polyunsaturated fats. They aren't bad. The goal is just to focus on omega-3 sources, so flaxseed oil, chia seeds, walnuts, and to hold back from using industrial processed seed oils that have been exposed to high heats and unfortunately degrade. We didn't really talk about protein, and sometimes it's the forgotten macronutrient in all this keto fun because it's kind of neutral. The reality is for most ketogenic diets, we focus on the fat, we focus on the carbs, and the protein is a situation of you meet the needs of the patient. So whatever their protein needs, you meet those needs. You're not restricting protein, but you also don't want to exceed protein because that can sometimes negate ketosis. So sometimes what happens with especially in the adult population, is how aggressive you can be with keto therapy is limited by how much protein they need because you can't restrict that. You want to make sure you're maintaining a good protein level. When you choose proteins, make sure you eat clean proteins to the best of your ability. Grass-fed beef, wild salmon, pasture-raised eggs or chicken. If those are feasible and attainable in your area or your client's area, choose those. For example, compared to conventionally raised chickens, pasture-raised poultry has 3 times the omega-3s, 50% more vitamin A, D, and E. So it really, again, quality really can make a difference. So that is all I have. We're going to open up for questions. So while you're typing in your questions, I know we have a ton that have already been submitted. I do want to just direct your attention to 2 upcoming webinars we have. Save the date here. Registration will open soon. We'll send you an email. In regards to this webinar, you should receive your continuing professional education certificate and references by the end of the day today, if not tomorrow. If you don't, please reach out to us. We want to make sure that you get those. So give me just a second to look at these questions here, and then I'll start fielding them for Dr. Bagnulo and I. Oh, I love this question. Okay, Dr. Bagnulo, I'm going to let you take this one, okay? If the brain does not recognize a change in postprandial energy increases, then is this the reason why I feel like I'm tired and sleeping all the time when I'm on the keto diet?
Well, that is a great question, Laura, and I would, really emphasize the importance of expecting a transition period while someone becomes metabolically adapted to a ketogenic diet. There's some lag time before they actually start to feel more alert and have a greater ability to focus and more of that kind of cerebral energy we're talking about. So that is very common in the first week, 2 weeks, sometimes even a little bit longer for people that are not keto adapted. But what most people share with me, and Laura, I'd love to hear your experiences. Most people say to me, after they get through that adjustment period, they feel significantly greater ability to focus and much more alert and have much more mental energy. But there's definitely an adaptation period.
I totally agree. I would generally, when I was counseling patients, say, the first 1 or 2 weeks, expect to be tired. That's a normal process. That's something we would check on when we were talking to patients and their families, 1 to 2 weeks. After like 2 weeks, we started thinking, okay, are we restricting the carbs too much? Are we not getting enough calories? Are we not getting enough protein? We start looking at it and trying to determine, does something need tweak to combat that? Because it shouldn't be a long-term thing. So totally agree. A few other questions here, and I'll take this one. Do you recommend people check ketone levels? So it's a good question. Most of the recommendations I gave today were very general to kind of this overarching ketogenic diet theme. So in terms of checking ketones, that is going to be very individualized depending on why you're using it. You know, for example, epilepsy patients, yes, I always had them checking ketone levels. For people doing it, you know, more on a general overall health, I think checking ketone levels is an important check mark to make sure that your body is in ketosis. I think it's human beings like having something quantitative to look at to say, yes, I am doing something correct, I'm in ketosis, and that can be very positively rewarding. But I also think it's not, you can easily become obsessed with the numbers, which are going to fluctuate a lot. And so I think people who are on ketogenic diets for a long time, they can ultimately tell when they're in ketosis. So it's really individualized. I think it's something that the dietitian following the patient has to decide what's best for that patient and what information, what are they going to do with that information. If checking ketones is going to trigger tweaking of the diet like it does often in epilepsy, then sure, that's a great resource. But that may not be the case for every patient. Another question. Did my patients ever have digestive issues with MCT oil? Oh, good question. Yes, they did. So what happens with MCT oil, from my experience, is if you ramp it up too fast, so let's say you go from eating no MCT oil and then you start taking it at every meal, 100%, I would predict digestive issues. So with anything, I think it's important to start small and work up. So as a general recommendation for an adult patient, I would maybe start, if they wanted to do coconut oil, I would maybe start with like a half a tablespoon and do that for a week. And then I go up to 1 tablespoon and maybe all the way up to 2 tablespoons a day, or maybe not that much depending on their ketone production. But it's definitely something where you want to start small and then gradually increase so that your digestive system can respond to that appropriately without having to run to the bathroom many times a day. So good question. I'm going to find one more question here. Oh, Dr. Bagnula, I'll let you take this one. Your feelings on restricted hours of eating, so more like an intermittent fasting, like how do you feel about that?
Yeah, obviously it's a really popular approach for so many people that are trying to get back to a better state of metabolic health. And there are some wonderful upsides to intermittent fasting, whether someone is fasting as short as 13 hours a day. There's some, Dale Bredesen, for instance, and others have some, really good research on the protective effect long term from just a 13-hour overnight fast. Again, intermittent fasting can be 16 or 18 hours long with a condensed eating window of something like 6 or 8 hours. I think there's a lot of very favorable aspects to that. But the one area that I always want to make sure that folks stay focused on is getting the nutrients that they need in that 6 or 8 hour window of time with which they are eating. And I think it's easier to do for certain nutrients than others. But protein and potassium are 2 nutrients that I always really focus on with the patients that I work with and clients. I always want to make sure that people are getting enough potassium daily. And you mentioned that here with the ketogenic diet. It's a big challenge, obviously, with this as well. So many people fall short of potassium, even if they're allowed to eat all day long. That if you really condense that window of eating to 6 or 8 hours, it's a major challenge. And so I don't like the intermittent fasting approach if it ends up sacrificing an individual's intake of certain nutrients. And I just use protein and potassium as an example because often people will just eat 2 meals a day. And if someone needs 40 grams of protein at each meal, to meet their requirements, they only get 20 grams of protein at each meal, then the intermittent fasting over time leads to a loss of lean body mass, and that includes skeletal mass. And similar things can be shown with respect to potassium. So I really like intermittent fasting. I'm not in any way discouraging folks from considering it or considering it as a potential tool for their patients, but I I would say that there are a lot of people out there practicing that way of eating, and they're missing out on some really important nutrients over a long period of time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think clinically for me, most of my ketogenic diet patients were on, supplements to some degree, multivitamins, calcium. Not that that's whole. I mean, obviously, I want to get everything in whole food, but maybe that's not realistic. And the potassium is a big one for that. I know I said that was our last question, but I feel like I want to answer this next question, and then we will let everybody get back to their very busy days. Um, how do my patients afford to eat like this? So this is a great question. So here's what I tell, and I don't clinically practice anymore, but for 14 years, one of the things that I felt like was really important to do was to do grocery shopping tours with my families that lived locally when we could do it, and really show them um, that the cost of processed junk food is expensive, and the cost of whole foods, produce, is not that expensive when you're looking at the nutrient quality. So it's a concept, right? And some people get it, some people don't. But I also feel like not all my ketogenic diet patients ate as clean as I would hope them in a perfect world, because we don't live in a perfect world. So, for example, where I live, I'm off one of the islands in South Carolina. We do have really readily available pasture-raised chickens everywhere. So that's something that's really feasible and attainable in my area, but finding grass-fed beef is very difficult. So I would have my patients focus on what they could do, what's attainable, what's financially feasible, where can I plug the holes, and do the best they can, because that's life. In trying to eat the best quality that they could, getting them into local services if we needed to, but also just focusing on portion sizes are much smaller in a ketogenic diet, so the food goes a lot further. But it's a great question and a huge problem in our country that food is quality food is so unaffordable, but awesome. So thank you everybody for tuning in. I'm so sorry we didn't get a chance to answer all of your amazing questions. This was great. I hope everybody learned something. Like I said, we'll be getting your certificates and references out by the end of the day today, hopefully, if not tomorrow. And always feel free to reach out to us if we can be of any help. Thank you. Have a good one.